When the police take your car, most people want it back. They call their lawyer. They call the department. They show up at the front desk, and they ask questions until someone gives them an answer. That is what people do. So when a retired FBI special agent looked at this case and said out loud, on camera, that he had never worked an investigation where a family did not push to get their vehicle returned, the question is not what law enforcement knows. The question is why no one is asking. This is the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, Catalina Foothills, Tucson, Arizona. Reported missing on the morning of February 1st, 2026, after she did not show up for a church live stream she never missed. What investigators found when they arrived at her home was not a scene of obvious chaos. It was something quieter and more disturbing than that. Her phone was on the counter. Her medication was still in the house. Her personal belongings were exactly where she had left them. Nancy was not. The Pima County Sheriff's Department classified it as an abduction. The FBI joined within days. Tips flooded in by the tens of thousands. Surveillance footage was released. A suspect was described. A reward was announced, then doubled, then raised again to $1 million by her family. And still, as of the time this video was recorded, Nancy Guthrie has not been found. No arrest has been made. No suspect has been named. But in the middle of all of that, one detail kept coming back. A car that belonged to Nancy's daughter and son-in-law was taken into police custody early in the investigation. The family had been officially cleared as suspects by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Their searches were consent searches, meaning law enforcement had no probable cause to treat them as persons of interest. And yet, nearly 4 weeks after the investigation began, that car had still not been returned. A reporter asked about it. The department confirmed it. The car, they said, was still part of the investigation. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore went on News Nation and said something that has stayed with investigators and true crime analysts ever since. He said that in his experience, families always push to get their property back. They knock on doors. They make calls. It always happens, he said. But in this case, it had not happened. And he could not explain why. That is the question this video is built around. Not who took Nancy Guthrie. The investigation is still open, and no one has been charged. But something stranger and more specific than that. Why is no one asking for the car back? Subscribe to True Crime with Liam if you want to follow this one through, because the answer to that question touches every layer of this case. She could not walk 50 yards on her own. That is not a detail someone added for context. That is a statement Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos made on the record to explain why investigators were certain, from the beginning, that Nancy Guthrie had not left her home by choice. She had serious mobility limitations. She required daily medication for her heart. Her pacemaker was synced to a Bluetooth monitoring application on her iPhone, which meant that a device implanted inside her chest was quietly, constantly, sending a signal to a phone sitting on a counter in her house. That phone was her connection to emergency services, to her children, to the outside world. She left it behind. This is the part of the story that does not get enough attention, not the surveillance footage, not the reward money. The fact that an 84-year-old woman with significant physical limitations was living alone in a large house in the Catalina Foothills, and that for more than 12 hours after she was taken, no one knew she was gone. That is not a criticism of her family. It is a structural observation about how her life was arranged and why that arrangement matters for understanding what happened next. The Catalina Foothills is an affluent suburb north of Tucson. The houses are large. The lots are spread out. The kind of neighborhood where a car arriving at 2 in the morning does not automatically trigger a call to the police. Nancy had lived in the Tucson area for more than 5 decades. She was a widow. Her husband Charles died in 1988 while on a mining exploration trip in Mexico when he was 49 years old. She raised her 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron, largely on her own after that. By February 2026, those children were adults with their own families, their own homes, their own lives. Annie lived 4 miles away. Savannah was in New York, co-anchoring the Today Show on NBC. The night of January 31st, 2026, was a Saturday. Nancy spent the evening at Annie's home for dinner. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, drove her home afterward. According to CBS News, she arrived at her daughter's house at 5:32 in the evening. She left around 9:48 at night. Tioni waited until she was inside before he drove away. That detail matters. He did not drop her at the curb. He waited. The door closed. He left. And inside that house, everything was fine, or appeared to be, for a few hours more. Nancy had a standing Sunday morning commitment, a church live stream. A member of her congregation would later say she never missed it. When she did not appear the following morning, that member contacted the family. Annie and her husband went to the house around 11 in the morning. They searched the property. They found no sign of her. At noon, they called 911. What they did not know, and what investigators would piece together over the following days, was that by the time Annie knocked on that door, Nancy had already been gone for nearly 10 hours. And something had happened on that front porch that no one in the family could have prepared for. There is no gentle way to describe what the evidence showed. So this is what it showed. At approximately 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, 2026, the doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's front entrance was tampered with. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed this timing. The camera did not malfunction. Someone interfered with it deliberately, using their gloved hand to cover the lens rather than remove the device entirely. That distinction matters, and investigators noticed it immediately. At 2:12 in the morning, a separate surveillance system captured a figure approaching the home. The footage was not high resolution, but the figure was there, moving toward the house. Deliberate. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker stopped transmitting its Bluetooth signal to her iPhone. Law enforcement has identified that moment as the most likely time of her abduction, not an estimated window, a specific minute, because the device inside her chest stopped communicating with the phone on her counter, and it has not communicated since. The FBI released video footage on February 10th. The footage showed a person standing on Nancy Guthrie's front porch in the early morning hours of February 1st. The individual was wearing a ski mask and gloves. There was a holster on the front of their body. A backpack, later identified by the FBI as a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack, was on their back. The Ozark Trail brand is a private label brand exclusive to Walmart. The FBI noted this publicly and said investigators were looking into whether it had been purchased online. Retired FBI agent Johnny Grusing, who spent 25 years in the FBI's Denver division investigating violent crimes and missing persons, analyzed the footage publicly on Fox News. He made two observations that have continued to shape how analysts think about this case. First, the suspect was not trying to remove the doorbell camera. He was trying to cover it with his hand. That behavior, Grusing said, is not consistent with someone who planned to break in undetected. It is more consistent with someone who wanted to conceal their face from a specific angle while still engaging with whoever was inside. Second, the holster. The gun appeared to be in a cheap holster, worn at the front of the body. Grusing described this placement as not tactically sound and noted that with the thick gloves the suspect was wearing, firing the weapon would have been extremely difficult. His conclusion: the gun may have been a prop, a tool to create fear, not to use. On the front porch, there was blood, confirmed by investigators to be Nancy's. It was found at the entrance and along the driveway. No blood was reported inside the house by officials. Nancy's phone remained on the counter. Her medication remained in the house. Her glasses, her personal belongings, the things a person does not leave behind when they choose to go somewhere, all of it remained. The security gate on the front door of Nancy's home is built to resist entry from the outside. Investigators looked closely at it. NewsNation reported that law enforcement was examining the theory that the gate was opened from the inside, which would suggest a second individual was already inside the home when the person in the ski mask appeared on the porch. This remains an unconfirmed theory based on the physical characteristics of the gate, but it has not been dismissed. What the investigation had, as of the first days, was surveillance footage of one individual, a confirmed abduction, a specific timestamp from a pacemaker, and a front porch with blood on it. What it did not have was a name. On February 1st, 2026, the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI began what would become one of the most closely watched missing persons investigations in the country. And the first question they had to answer was the same one that every true crime analyst, every retired agent, and every person watching this video has had to sit with since. If someone took Nancy Guthrie, why have they not asked for anything in return? More than 13,000 tips came in during the first month. The The FBI's Phoenix office confirmed the number publicly. They also confirmed that among those tips, there was concern that some individuals with genuinely useful information had not come forward. Because they feared being identified in a high-profile case, the tip line remained open. The billboards went up in California. The reward climbed. On February 10th, the FBI released the doorbell footage. Alongside the description of the suspect, they noted specific details: approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, average build, the Ozark Trail backpack. Retired FBI profiler Jim Clemente appeared on News Nation and pointed out that the suspect had not anticipated the doorbell camera and had made what Clemente called big mistakes. In the footage, a portion of what may be a tattoo was visible. The suspect's mouth was not covered, which Clemente noted would likely mean he left DNA evidence at the scene. On February 13th, a delivery driver named Luke Daly was detained by Pima County Sheriff's deputies and questioned by the FBI. Investigators carried out a court-authorized search of his home in Rio Rico, Arizona. He was held for approximately 4 to 5 hours. His Range Rover was towed for examination and later returned to him. His cell phone was taken. As of the time this video was recorded, according to reporting from Yahoo News, his cell phone had still not been returned to him. Daly told reporters he had nothing to do with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. He said he did not know her personally and had only become aware of who she was because his mother was following the case. He was released without charges. On February 15th, DNA was extracted from a pair of black gloves found discarded in roadside brush, approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. The gloves appeared, generically, to match the type worn by the suspect in the doorbell footage. Investigators sent the gloves to a lab and then submitted the profile to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. On February 17th, that search came back with no match. Then, on March 4th, the Pima County Sheriff's Department announced that further DNA analysis, using investigative genetic genealogy, had traced the gloves to a local restaurant employee who is, in the words of the department, not part of this investigation. A lead that had briefly seemed significant had led nowhere. A Ring camera, approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, captured footage of a vehicle passing by around the same time. Her pacemaker stopped transmitting. Sheriff Nanos confirmed to NBC News that investigators had not yet identified that vehicle. He said they were looking at it alongside, in his words, hundreds of thousands of other vehicles that were out driving at that time of day. Inside the home, a mixed DNA sample had been collected. The sheriff confirmed it did not belong to Nancy or to anyone in close contact with her. He acknowledged that the mixture might contain DNA from more than one person, which made extraction of a usable single profile significantly more difficult. Genetic genealogy was being pursued. Neighbors told News Nation in mid-March that FBI agents had returned to the area asking about footage from 2 specific dates, January 11th and January 24th, both Sundays, both falling in the weeks before Nancy's disappearance. Investigators did not say publicly what they were looking for, but both dates fell on weekends, and the working theory among analysts was that someone had been in the neighborhood before February 1st, watching, mapping the area, learning the routines. According to ABC News, sources familiar with the investigation indicated that the masked suspect may have appeared at Nancy Guthrie's front door earlier than February 1st. The FBI reportedly obtained footage from inside an Uber rideshare vehicle that may represent the last known recording of Nancy Guthrie before her disappearance. The Uber footage had not been described in detail publicly. Every lead had either stalled or closed without producing a name. Every physical item of evidence had been collected and sent for analysis. And the investigation, nearly 7 weeks in, had produced no arrest and no confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie. What it had produced was a clearer picture of what kind of crime this was. And that picture was the one that kept every experienced investigator in this case awake at night. There is a pattern in criminal investigations that experienced agents recognize quickly. When evidence stops producing answers, the shape of what is missing becomes more important than what has been found. By the time the Nancy Guthrie investigation entered its 2nd month, that shape was becoming visible, not because of what law enforcement had announced, because of what they had not announced, and because of the specific questions that kept surfacing from people who had spent careers reading cases exactly like this one. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente had noted the suspect's mistakes on camera, but he had also said something that received less attention. He described the individual as someone who was probably in his 30s or 40s, and someone who had exhibited what investigators call pre- and post-offense behavior that people around him could observe. That framing matters. It means the person who did this did not vanish into abstraction. He moved through the world before February 1st, and he moved through it afterward. Someone saw something. The question was whether that person understood what they had seen. The ransom situation had become one of the most disorienting elements of the entire case. Multiple notes had surfaced. At least one demanded $6 million in Bitcoin, with a deadline of 5 in the afternoon on February 9th. That deadline passed. Nothing happened. The family had publicly said they were willing to pay. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings released a video in which they said, directly to camera, "We received your message, and we understand, and we will pay." That video exists. The deadline came and went. There was no response. Derek Colella, a 42-year-old man from California, had been arrested on federal charges for sending a fraudulent ransom message to Annie Guthrie and her husband. His case was unrelated to the other demands that had circulated, but his arrest raised a question that investigators and analysts could not easily dismiss. If one person had already fabricated a ransom demand to exploit the family's desperation, how confident could anyone be about the authenticity of the other notes? The FBI had said publicly they were studying the materials. They had not confirmed any of them as genuine communication from whoever actually took Nancy. What that left, structurally, was an abduction with no verified captor communication more than 6 weeks in. Former FBI hostage negotiator Christopher Massey had described this to NBC News in terms that were direct. Without a voice, without a channel, a significant portion of his training and background became unusable. Written materials alone could provide leads, but they could also be used to deceive. The absence of direct communication was not just emotionally devastating for the family, it was operationally crippling for investigators. The security gate had not been explained. The mixed DNA inside the home had not been resolved. The vehicle on the Ring camera remained unidentified. And the sheriff had acknowledged, in an interview that aired nationally, that investigators believed they knew why Nancy Guthrie was targeted, but declined to share that information publicly. He said they had information they believed would help solve the case. He said it takes time. Meanwhile, the FBI had returned to the neighborhood in the weeks prior to this video being recorded, asking former neighbors who had recently moved away about what they had observed in the months before the abduction. They were also asking about construction workers active on properties nearby. Retired Agent Steve Moore had noted publicly that the inquiry into construction workers was a detail that stood out to him. Not because construction workers were suspects, but because someone conducting surveillance on a neighborhood would blend into that environment more easily if they had a plausible reason to be present. Dr. Ann Burgess, the FBI profiling pioneer whose work shaped the Bureau's behavioral science approach for decades, had framed the central question of the case in a way that no other analyst had quite matched. She said that in situations like this, you have to ask who benefits. You have to ask who this is going to affect the most. Those are the questions she would begin with, she said, because they point toward a motive that is not random, and everything in this case, every behavioral detail, every choice the suspected abductor made that night, pointed away from randomness and toward intention. Subscribe to True Crime with Liam if you are following this case. Drop a comment below with what you think the ransom silence means. I read every one of them. And this particular question is one I want to hear your thinking on. That intention is what every profiler who has engaged with this case has circled back to. And when you line up what they have each said independently across different platforms and different interviews, a framework emerges that the investigation itself has not publicly contradicted. Johnny Grusing's analysis on Fox News was specific. The suspect's behavior at the front door was not burglary behavior. Someone intending to rob a home in an affluent neighborhood does not ring the doorbell at 2 in the morning. They do not cover a camera with their hand instead of removing it. They do not wear a holster with what may be a non-functional prop weapon at the front of their body. Grusing said the behavior was more consistent with a confrontation. Someone who wanted to be face-to-face with Nancy Guthrie. Someone who, in his words, wanted to confront her about something. Dr. Ann Burgess placed this in a broader behavioral category. She said the crime appeared to be personal, that there was a grievance being expressed or attempted. She noted that nothing in Nancy Guthrie's background made her an obvious target for criminal enterprise. She was not a wealthy public figure in her own right. She was not known to carry large sums of money. She was not involved in any known dispute with organized criminal networks. The profile of a stranger-based opportunistic crime did not fit. What fit, Burgess said, was the profile of someone acting out of a personal cause. The car question returns here with a different weight than it carried at the start of this video. Retired. Agent Steve Moore had noted the unusual absence of any family pressure to retrieve Annie and Tommaso's vehicle. But what Moore also explained, on the same broadcast, was the legal reason a car might remain in custody even after a family has been cleared. The FBI cannot release potential evidence until the United States Attorney's Office has authorized that release. The decision is not made by local law enforcement. It is not made by the FBI agents working the case. It requires formal approval from federal prosecutors, who are evaluating what might be needed for a future trial. That framing changes the question. The car is not being held because the family is suspected. The car is being held because someone in the federal prosecutorial chain believes it may have evidentiary value at a trial that has not yet happened, for a suspect who has not yet been identified or charged. The question of why no one is loudly demanding it back is a separate question entirely, and the most generous answer is also the simplest one. The family of a missing 84-year-old woman, in the middle of the worst experience of their lives, may not be prioritizing a vehicle. What Coffin Daffer had said in her analysis was also worth sitting with. The searches of family vehicles had been conducted with consent. No probable cause had been established. In her experience, that distinction was meaningful. Investigators who believe someone is involved do not ask for permission. The consent framing told her, she said, that the family was not the focus of the investigation. The behavioral profile from multiple independent profilers was pointing toward a grievance crime. The physical evidence was pointing toward planning. The communication pattern, or more precisely the absence of it, was pointing toward someone who either panicked after the scope of national attention became clear, or who had never intended a ransom scenario in the first place. Former ATF agent Jim Cavanaugh had put it plainly. It got too big, too fast. And then he asked the question that no one has yet answered. If that is what happened, why has no one released her? Share this video if you are following the Nancy Guthrie case. The people closest to a suspect often know something is wrong before they know what it is. Share it with someone who might recognize the pre- and post-offense behavior that Jim Clemente described. And subscribe to True Crime with Liam, because when this case breaks, I will cover it the same day. There are things this investigation has produced that will outlast the case itself, regardless of how it resolves. The first is about how we think about vulnerability and surveillance. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker became the most important forensic witness in the case. Not a camera, not a neighbor, a medical device. As more older adults live alone and rely on connected health technology, that technology creates a record of their lives that can be used in their defense or in the investigation of what happened to them. That record exists whether or not anyone plans for it. The question is whether families and law enforcement know how to access it quickly enough to matter. The second is about the behavioral indicators that preceded this crime. FBI investigators asking about footage from January 11th and January 24th were not looking for the abduction itself. They were looking for surveillance behavior. For someone moving through the neighborhood in the weeks before, establishing patterns, identifying routines. When those dates fell on Sundays, the same day as Nancy's church commitment, that detail became harder to dismiss as coincidence. What this case teaches us about targeted crimes involving elderly individuals living alone is that the vulnerability is rarely financial in the obvious sense. It is logistical. An elderly person alone in a large home in a quiet neighborhood is not protected by their wealth. They are exposed by it. The gap between their physical limitations and the resources required to monitor their safety is exactly the kind of gap that a planned crime can exploit. Community awareness, regular welfare checks, and a basic understanding of what surveillance behavior looks like in a residential neighborhood are not law enforcement functions. They are neighborhood functions. And in this case, they are the functions that failed. Nancy Guthrie has been missing since February 1st, 2026. The investigation is active. The reward for information leading to her recovery stands at over $1,200,000 combined from her family, the FBI, and the 88 crime line. If you have information, The number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can also submit tips at tips.fbi.gov. The car will eventually be returned. The DNA will eventually be processed. The investigation will eventually produce an answer. What we do not know is when. And there is one question I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first read this case. The profilers say this was personal. The behavioral evidence says someone wanted to confront Nancy directly. And the FBI says they believe they know why she was targeted. If all three of those things are true at the same time, then somewhere in Nancy Guthrie's life, there was a thread. Something that connected her to whoever did this. That thread has not been named publicly. I will be covering this case as it develops. I am Liam, and I will see you in the next video.